So I'm going to kind of kick it off, and then Julie will talk about some of the research that we're doing here at Penn State. But I sort of wanted to introduce this just as what the problem is and where we're seeing the biggest impact, in particular, with our agricultural focus. And then, of course, Julie will go in and talk about, some of our efforts that we're taking in each of those industries and how we're hoping to really reduce that impact. And I know a lot of you have already had direct experience with spotted lanternfly and have kind of seen what it's like out there already. But for those of you who haven't had an update recently on spotted lanternfly, you'll notice that our quarantine has expanded within Pennsylvania. So now we're at 26 counties. So again, started in Berks County in 2014 and has since expanded. We also have considerable populations in New Jersey, in Delaware, Virginia, Maryland, and West Virginia as well. So all the blue areas on that map are places where we have an infestation, and then all the red dots on that map are places where we've picked up a spotted lanternfly individual. So it doesn't mean that there's a population present, but certainly we know that this bug is a really good hitchhiker. I will talk about this more, as will Julie. This bug moves, it moves around in our landscape, and it's really difficult to predict that movement. And especially when we talk about people going camping, about agricultural equipment being shipped, we end up in a pretty serious problem here pretty quickly. And then, of course, many of you may have seen this video already. It almost does my extension work for me when I can show a video like this of how dramatic these populations can be, especially late into the season where we just see really high populations of lanternfly. And for the most part, historically, this has been in kind of Berks County where it all first started, and more as the years go on, we're starting to see that spread. And sort of a spoiler alert for 2020 is that we expect this year to be a big year. And if you haven't already seen some nymphs out there, there's quite a few out there. There's a lot of egg masses hatching, and we expect a pretty healthy population this year. And of course, this becomes a public awareness issue when you get this kind of accumulation in people's backyards. In some cases, lanternfly falling down people's chimneys, so actually getting inside their homes, or kind of lining up on the outside of people's homes and on the windows. So people are very exposed to this. We also have egg masses being laid on patio cushions, on flower boxes, camping chairs, light bulbs, and on this lady's hat. So again, very much this is an insect in the public eye, and it makes our job, my job, very interesting. The public reaction to spotted lanternfly can be very humorous sometimes, so they create all sorts of memes on social media and online to talk about sort of their experience with spotted lanternfly. And of course, we also have some really creative people who want to get out there and show their lanternfly spirit and dress their dogs up and their kids up with lanternfly costumes. And then we even have some of our local breweries, bars, and wineries that are actually making spotted lanternfly on the label of their products to kind of bring awareness to spotted lanternfly. There's somebody in southeastern Pennsylvania who's made an app to talk about, squishing spotted lanternfly. We have an artist that came up from Virginia to work with Penn State Lehigh Valley campus to actually make artwork out of spotted lanternfly wings. And we have people making jewelry and Christmas tree ornaments with spotted lanternfly. And then, of course, I think the most extreme example that we saw was in Philadelphia this past year, where we had large populations, and we kind of expect that to continue, where we saw lanternfly climbing, ninth-story floor balconies, and people calling in and complaining about that. And the people they were calling were actually the police. And so the Philadelphia police had to issue a statement, albeit a comical one, to say, please stop calling the police to report this insect, right? So again, just kind of showing how much people are sort of freaking out about this. And I really like this comic. I think it really accurately depicts what is happening in the public perception of spotted lanternfly. And I don't mean at all to say that it's not a serious issue in terms of what the public is dealing with, but I think because we have so much information out there and so many people freaking out, it's difficult to really distill down what's actually happening, especially in the context of agricultural impact. And so if we kind of back up here and talk about spotted lanternfly biology a little bit more briefly here, one of the reasons that spotted lanternfly is such a good invader is because it has a really broad host range. So it feeds on over 70 different plant species. Now it does have sort of this preferred list of hosts, and then also sort of unlikely hosts that it's not likely to be found feeding on. But by and large, it has a very, very wide host range. And some of this includes agricultural crops. So we have them recorded feeding on corn, on soybeans, on alfalfa, and some other row crops. Certainly we have them feeding on hops, people's backyard vegetable plants and herbs, so basil, blueberry, strawberry in some cases, cucumber as well. And then of course backyard plants like hibiscus, lily. Right now they're really feeding on peonies, and we have a lot of people who are upset and really value their peonies and have lanternfly all over them. Because it has such a broad host range, it becomes really difficult to understand, again, what that feeding impact is and what industries are actually at risk. So I think the best way to kind of distill this down is to kind of talk about what the potential risk is from spotted lanternfly in the first place and where you can start to see some of that risk. So one is, of course, feeding damage from spotted lanternfly. So what's actually being hit from that direct feeding damage. And then we have reported nuisance. So this is more so on the homeowner side. So we have their honeydew excretion, sooty mold because of that honeydew, and then the bugs themselves. And then lastly, we have that compliance with quarantine, which is a huge part that our businesses really struggle with, to make sure that they're not accidentally spreading spotted lanternfly and making sure that they're checking their plant material. And this is particularly applicable in nursery operations. So if we talk about who is at risk from spotted lanternfly and kind of where we fall in those categories, grape growers, I would say, are absolutely number one, where we're getting significant feeding damage and also a nuisance problem at wineries. And then we have the ornamental nursery operations. So again, that's quarantine compliance, but then we also have some signs of feeding damage. We have Christmas tree growers, where that predominantly started as quarantine compliance, but sort of turned into a public perception issue, if you've been familiar at all in following that. And then of course we have homeowners, so the nuisance pest, and we are also getting some feeding damage. Now, it's completely possible that the situation changes and we get other industries, other agricultural industries, more at risk. So repeated feeding on the same trees, if this year happens to be a dry year, which so far it's kind of shaping up to be, or if lanternfly can vector diseases, that situation can change. But right now I would say that these are the groups that are most at risk. So I'm just going to talk about those top three, since there are, our agricultural industries and how they've been affected and sort of how they're dealing with it. And then I'll hand it over to Julie to talk about, again, our research focused in those industries. So really quickly, the Christmas tree stories here. For those of you who have experienced spotted lanternfly directly, you know that spotted lanternfly will fly and walk on anything, and that includes Christmas trees. So they're not feeding on the Christmas trees themselves, but they can use it as a launching point, and if they're walking around on it, that means they'll also lay egg masses on it. And so this happened a few years back, and we saw, and it's, if you can imagine trying to scout for spotted lanternfly egg masses and sticking your head in a Christmas tree, these growers were really facing some difficulty with that. The good thing is that what we're seeing is that this is very rare. So egg masses have only been observed on Christmas trees where we have a really significant population of spotted lanternfly right next to that Christmas tree operation. The bad news is that we had the media pick up on a story that had this headline in it, right? And so, of course, that's a pretty damaging headline to the Christmas tree industry. And the media sort of took that and ran with it. And we had all sorts of other ones where people were actually saying, I don't want to buy a Christmas tree because it's going to have this bug is going to infest my home if I buy a Christmas tree. So the growers became very worried about this. I will say this is sort of a success story so far, and that we started to put out some better press out there. Both the growers worked with their association, growers worked directly with the media, and growers worked with Penn State Extension to really get that information out there and say that the risk is really low, and there's really easy ways that we can kind of remediate that risk, even though it is really low. And so luckily, for the most part, this past year, it really hasn't been much of an issue for growers, and so we're hoping that next year we can kind of keep that up as well. And then moving on to nursery operations. So if you're thinking about ornamental nursery operations, and some of spotted lanternfly's favorite hosts include things like maples and willows and styrax, and these are all valued nursery operation plants. So it's sort of a buffet of their favorite foods that are all very healthy and perfect for them to feed on. I'm not going to talk about this one too much, but we recently had a meeting with nursery operations, mostly in Berks County, and asked them what is their primary concern with spotted lanternfly. And And by and large, they said that shipping in and out of the quarantine zone or getting quarantine violations was the thing that they were most worried about, followed by loss of customers. Now, this is sort of a big list, and they're worried about all of these things, but by and large, keeping up with those quarantine regulations is very difficult for them, especially thinking about all the labor involved in that. And so again, they'll crawl on anything. And if you think about, shipping out some trees like that look like this to say New York, and trying to inspect that material becomes really difficult. I'm not going to go too much into the details here, but we have started to work with these nurseries, and really the nurseries have taken the lead on how to sort of alleviate some of the lanternfly, especially when they're working around their loading dock and actually loading that plant material into trucks. And we're starting to continue to look at other options that they can use. And I think Julie will talk about that a little bit more as well. And then lastly, talking about damage to specialty crops. So this is talked about a lot with spotted lanternfly, where it says it feeds, on tree fruit. It's going to potentially destroy our tree fruit industry in Pennsylvania, peaches, grapes, and hops as well. And so certainly, again, we see them feeding on tree fruit. So here's a video I took, this is 2 years ago now, of high populations feeding on apple trees. And this was in Berks County, close to the original infestation. And of course, we see that flight activity as well. So lots of lanternfly up in the sky, and so much so that it took about maybe a minute for me to accumulate all of these lanternfly on me just as I was walking around this orchard, right? So they will get on anything, and that includes shipping material and again, these trees. But for the most part, feeding is only observed for less than 2 weeks, and often it's just a couple of days before they move off of these trees. So it does not appear at this point that tree fruit is a desirable host for them. Again, if they get into Adams County, where we have a lot more tree fruit, that situation could change. But at this point, I don't know of any grower who's actually sprayed for spotted lanternfly in their orchard, and we don't have economic damage reported for this particular industry. That said, it's not an area without complaints. So we do have issues with U-pick operations. If you have lanternfly swarming, people don't want to be out picking apples or peaches with U-pick operations. And then of course that quarantine compliance also becomes very difficult for them to manage. But so far that one has not been as big of an issue as we sort of initially thought. Vineyards, grapevines, that's a completely different story, where we get significant feeding on these grapevines and they stay there. It seems to be a very desirable host for them. Just some photo evidence of what that looks like. Here's dead lanternfly bodies after the growers spray. Some more examples of what that looks like, where you can see those kind of gray dead bodies, and this is after multiple insecticide applications, where it almost looks like you're mulching with spotted lanternfly. I was out yesterday, and these are some of the photos I took at the vineyards that I visited, where you can see large numbers of egg masses and nymphs hatching out from those egg masses on the posts within the vineyard, and then also starting to feed on those shoots. So already this year we're getting really significant pressure. And again, this is primarily feeding damage that we're seeing from these grapevines. So when we talk to the growers and talk about what they're experiencing, and I know you'll hear a recorded video from Darv, and he'll kind of share some of that information, but we're getting these growers that are reporting yield losses and vine death from spotted lanternfly. Now, what we think is going on here is that lanternfly are reducing the vine's ability to survive winter, and Julie will show some of that data. But basically, we're ending up with about 30% of our growers in the previous quarantine zone before it expanded that are reporting damage from spotted lanternfly, and they're also increasing their insecticide applications and of course their costs per acre of those insecticide applications. I also want to mention that it's not just the economic damage that these growers are facing. I think there's also a considerable amount of social sort of duress that they're dealing with this insect. So when we ask the growers that are dealing with spotted lanternfly how they sort of feel about lanternfly, 57% of them say that this knowledge of lanternfly and their ability to cause damage to their grapevines actually changes the outlook when they think about the future of their farm, so replanting or expanding. So that is a pretty scary number when you think about Pennsylvania wines and trying to grow that industry. And then 62% say that lanternfly contributes either moderately or highly to their stress level. So again, if they're having to kind of be out on their sprayer constantly trying to manage these high populations, that probably changes their enjoyment of what they're doing and how they can manage that. So I think those are also really important considerations that we need to keep in mind. So again, not just that economic damage, but also what the grower is having to face. So again, just talking about who's at risk from lanternfly, we have grape growers, those ornamental nursery operations, and Christmas tree growers, and then of course the homeowners, which we're keeping in mind as well. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Julie, and she can talk more about sort of how we're addressing spotted lanternfly management and what we're learning about it to sort of solve some of these problems that I talked about.
Great, thank you, Heather. So I'll go ahead and see if I can share my screen. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Heather, I can see you. Is it thumbs up? Can you see my screen? Okay, great. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview on some of the research going on spotted lanternfly. And I basically, by training, I work on the biology of plant hoppers. And so spotted lanternfly is a plant hopper. How you can recognize that from this picture here is that plant hoppers have bristle-like antennae beneath the eye. So this little orange thing is the base of the antennae of these insects. There's over 14,000 described species of lanternflies around the world. The lanternfly family, Fulgoridae, is one family that I've done some research on. And so I just want to point out that it was September 22nd, 2014, when the presence of lanternfly was confirmed in Berks County. And within the next 2 weeks, the USDA had assembled a scientific working group of scientists from around the country and some from China and Korea as well. And so I became a member of that group in early October 2014. And we've been advising USDA and Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture and doing research on it since that time. At that time, I was working in a museum in North Carolina. And in 2016, I had the opportunity to come to Penn State. And for those of you, who are familiar with the lanternfly story, things really hit the fan, so to speak, in 2017. We saw the populations were much worse. That's when we saw that moving into Orchard. That's when Senator Schwenk put together the legislative hearing on this and whatnot. And so while there was research going on prior to that point, there was no real one organized effort for it. And so one of the things we started to do to organize that was to put together a multi-institutional specialty crops research initiative grant, and we submitted that to USDA. We only recently received funding for this grant last year, but I'm very happy. You can see I'm the project director for it. Heather's the co-project director, and we have 37 researchers and extension personnel from all of these institutions in the Northeast. So Penn State's leading it, but we have a lot of collaborative work going on with it. And in this particular grant, we were funded for $7.3 million, but we needed to provide a dollar for dollar match with non-federal funds, to receive this grant. And so a lot of that match came from growers who committed to us use of their land for us to conduct spotted lanternfly research. So I was very pleased that we received over $5 million in matching funds from this use of grower land for research. So Darb Levengood is one of those folks, as with many other folks in Eastern Pennsylvania. So this is really a strong collaborative project that will make sure that the research we're doing is actually useful to growers and other stakeholders. But as I just mentioned, it was just this last year we've received this grant. And prior to that, it was apparent that a lot of research needed to be done. And so with funding from USDA, from Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, and from the College of Agriculture at Penn State, I want to tell you about some of the first sets of studies that we did. And so the first wave of attack that we took in our research was to investigate the efficacy of different insecticides, contact insecticides, insecticides for homeowner products and for growers, insecticides targeting the eggs, and on ornamentals, and using biological compounds, Bavaria bassiana, or a fungus, a fungus that kills insects. But what was interesting with this is that we have, Heather and I are located in University Park. Our fruit researchers are located at the Fruit Research and Extension Center down in Biglerville. And so basically any of us who were doing this research are about, over 2 hours away. And so we needed to figure out a way to do this work in the quarantine zone. And so it was, really a great collaboration that folks at the Penn State Berks campus decided to allow us to essentially turn their turf farm, their turf research plot, into a place for us to do these insecticide trials. So we bought hundreds of grapevines and peach trees that were potted. And here you can see this is David Vinegar from our fruit research station in Biglerville with his crew. David and Heather really led these studies, and we, collected weekly nymphs or adults by the multiple thousands and put them on these plants, and did a series of studies last year and the year before. And from that, that was the basis of a publication Heather led. But basically, all of these research results are the basis for our management recommendations for lanternfly that are available on the Penn State website. And so we're continuing to update those, focusing more on homeowner products and ornamental products, but also with work that Heather's doing this year to really test what the extent to which these products work actually in vineyards. And so we'll keep updating it, but our insecticide work has been a big emphasis of what we've been doing at Penn State. And largely what we found is that a lot of different products are really effective in killing these insects. Not a lot have great longevity or residual activity, but lanternflies are pretty easy to kill. And so another first pass we did, okay, how do you manage them, and how can we predict when the hatch occurs? And so my student, Erica Smyers, got to work in collecting, enclosing egg cases in the field, monitoring hatch dates. This was coupled with some data that we got from folks in Virginia. And Erica ran some studies raising lanternfly in our quarantine lab on the Penn State campus. And she's developed a model for egg hatch so we can predict that. And just now we have that incorporated into Pest Watch. So you can see varying degrees, the closer you get to red, the closer you get to 100% hatch. So this is a tool that's available for growers now to know where hatch is happening. And you can see, I just took this morning, we have almost 100% egg hatch. And so the interesting thing here, though, is that, okay, we have, I'm not sure if Heather mentioned this, but lanternfly lives only one generation per year. It's not like spotted wing Drosophila or fruit fly that's, multiplying very, very rapidly. It goes through one generation a year. I already said a lot of different things will kill it. It's easy to kill, and we can predict it. So why is this critter such a pest? Why is it such a problem? Okay. And so if I step back and think about management, the management recommendations are timed to where the insect is in its life cycle. And so you're all probably familiar with the governmental control efforts that are aimed at treating tree of heaven or Ailanthus altissima, because that's a favorite host. And so we know that definitely early season adults are really prevalent on Ailanthus. And so treating Ailanthus with a systemic compound so that any insect that feeds on the sap of Ailanthus, can be killed. Removing other Ailanthus to make the remaining Ailanthus be trap trees, that's a really effective way to kill lanternfly, but we're seeing that the populations are still increasing, so that's not enough. And so certainly, during the egg stage, which occurs from about November through May, if you can scrape eggs, great. Oftentimes the eggs are really high up in the tree, so that's not necessarily effective. When nymphs hatch out, which as Heather just showed has been very recently, they go through a series of molts through 3 different instars where they're all black with white spots. And the thing here is that they'll feed on just about anything. Their mouth parts can't penetrate woody tissue, and they'll feed broadly, as Heather was saying, on peonies and everything in one's yard. And so why this is kind of problematic is that it's hard to predict any one plant they're going to feed on, because what they choose is kind of relative to what's around. But also when they're spread out so broadly, you don't really know how big the population is because they're not really apparent. As 4th instars, here, if I can get my clicker, 4th instars, they'll move onto woody tissue. We see them in numbers on black walnut. That's hard to treat because it's a fruit producing tree. But then really the nuts and bolts and what a lot of our research focuses on is this late season movement. In the late season movement, perhaps when Ailanthus starts to senesce or when they've tapped it out because so many have fed on it, we know that they move. They move on to red maple, silver maple, and that late season movement is when we see them going into vineyards, and that's when they're so problematic. And so if we kind of summarize this, in this life, the life stages, spotted lanternfly, as Heather showed, they'll lay their eggs on anything, right? Which include rail cars, people's vehicles, crates and different pallets, things that can be transported. That's how we think they got here from China, on a shipment of stone on a pallet. And they're in their egg case for 3/4 of the year. And so that's a really long time that they can potentially move and get to new places. The nymphs and adults feed on over 70 different species of trees and plants. So you really can't predict which plant or tree they're going to go to in your yard, and you can't really, you don't want to poison everything. The adults feed voraciously, and for an insect, they're feeding for 4 months, so a third of a year in this stage. And that's when they're feeding very voraciously, and why they're doing such a number to grapes and other plants. And then in this late season, September, October, is when they move, and they move into new areas and continue to feed. And again, we're getting good capability to predict the timing of this movement and the timing of these late stages, but it's really difficult to predict where they're going to move to. And so I want to mention, I don't know if you've seen this particular video, but my student Erica took this, and this is when they moved onto grapes in a vineyard in 2017. And this gives you a sense of how voraciously they're feeding. If you can see if you look over here in the left corner, you'll see this individual shooting out honeydew. They're feeding on sugary sap, so much so that they're excreting a lot of sugary sap, and that just coats surfaces, but you'll get, hundreds of lanternfly on a vine. So I'm going to jump ahead here. And so basically, this is a picture of Beekman's orchard after being hit for several years. This was taken last May, and essentially all 40 acres were dead from lanternfly, which is really just heartbreaking to see. And so this is another vineyard closer to Allentown, again, showing that damage. And so seeing this kind of damage, one of the important areas of research that we're looking at is physiologically, what is lanternfly doing to these vines? So, because then if we can understand that might allow us to come up with economic thresholds and whatnot. And so actually a version of this study had started out at Darv's Vineyard in Manatawny the year before, but the vines that we had planted there had died, and so we moved this over to Martin Kubek's house. But basically what you'll see here is a series of vines that he let us expose lanternfly to. So we built these cages or enclosures, and you can see we have dendrometers and phloemeters. This work's led by Michaela Centenari, who's our viticulturist. And basically what we did is we introduced either for control, or low, medium, and high numbers of lanternfly to these vines, and would let them feed for 4 days and then take them off to kind of simulate what would happen if a grower were to spray these. And did this and looked at various aspects of grape physiology. And what was really striking is that, wow, lanternfly really does a number pretty quickly to reduce photosynthesis in leaves. This is significant. It also, high levels of lanternfly also reduce leaf transpiration. And then we see an effect in it reducing the Brix or sugar content of the grapes. In the version of the study we had done at Manatawny the year before, and these were on Darv's actual vines, what we saw is, in measures that were taken in November and January, high levels of lanternfly feeding essentially increased the temperature at which 50% of the sampled buds died. So like, what's your freezing threshold? And so usually have a temperature at which, in this case, 50% of your vines will die, but if lanternfly feeds on it, that happened a full degree warmer in just this one study. And so similar work is being done by Kelly Hoover, but we're thinking that, this work will be repeated this year at Martin Kubek's or elsewhere. We're really trying to get a handle on exactly how lanternfly is able to incur the drastic damage that it does to grapevines. Other work in that late season, we know these lanternfly are feeding really, really heavily, and that's when they're becoming reproductively mature. And so here you can see, if you know your lanternfly biology, you can see both of these are females on the lower left. You can tell because that last segment of their abdomen has that little red area to it. And you can see these are both females. And so this female on the right, you can see all of this yellow exposed. And on the left, it's not exposed. It's like basically like they're wearing stretchy pants. And as as they feed, that stretches out, and you can see the yellow that's between the segments of their abdomen. And so you can see over here, as they become more reproductively mature, we get more yellow that's visible. And so I went to Vinecrest Winery last year and just took live weights of individuals over the course of that late season movement, and saw that females' mass over that time increased by over 50%, but also males increased very much too. So they're just feeding in numbers voraciously and really putting on the weight. And so what's interesting here is that we're trying to look at developing degree day models to understand this movement, and also to understand when they're mating, because that's when they're at risk for dispersal into new areas if females are mated. And what's really weird is that if we look from a degree day perspective, it takes about 1,200 degree days before you start seeing any adults develop at all. And so they go through 1,200 degree days before they get to the adult stage. It takes another over 600 degree days till we start to see that yellow showing that the females are developing. And it takes another 250 degree days before we really see them start to mate and lay eggs. So what's going on that you have this really long-lived adult time period, and what are they doing? Why do they need that much time to become reproductively mature? And so that's something that I'm working on. We're working again on, I'm doing a lot of dissections to determine how many times females mate and how this reproductive development and mating plays out. But what's, again, if you look at this from a calendar date here, we get our first adults appearing end of July, and we see this is the timing of that late season movement. And we see males and females move at different times, but really no egg deposition occurs until pretty late in the season. And so why do lanternfly need that developmental time period? That's one of the things we're interested in, because that could potentially be an Achilles heel, where they might be more sensitive for control. And with that, what I'm doing, I can't not show you my research, which is looking at a lot of bug guts. Okay, I get excited by this. But basically, I'm doing dissections to work out the timing of female reproductive development. You have on the top left, not much reproductive development. On the bottom right, really more developed eggs. Seeing what a spermatophore looks like so we can count how many times a female mates and whatnot. But the other part, besides just understanding the basics of the biology, what I'm interested in and doing a lot of research on has to do with bacteria that lanternfly harbor. Lanternfly and other sap-feeding insects have relationships with bacteria that feed them from the inside out. And so plant hoppers are the only animals on the planet known to actually house those bacteria in an organ. And so if you look at that in lanternfly, there was some light microscopy work that was done in the 1940s that sketched this all out. But really, we haven't been able to look at it in any lanternfly because they're mostly tropical species and we can't really do it. But if you look at our spotted lanternfly, holy cow, this orange thing is an organ right here that actually is just full of bacteria that work to feed the insect from the inside out. Other bacteria, there's 3 different species of bacteria that they harbor, and you can kind of see them as these little strings that are very colorful and pigmented. But you can kind of see it there. But what's interesting is that in order for these bacteria to get passed on to their offspring, they have to get transmitted to the lanternfly eggs. And so if you look, you can see this is an early season female where her bacterial organs are. And just a few weeks later, you can see that orange sausage-like organ that houses these bacteria. It turns pale, it starts to dissolve, as do the other ones. They change color and they move away from the digestive tract where they're kind of wrapped up, and they move toward the developing eggs. And so with DNA sequencing that I'm doing, I'm verifying the movement of these symbionts. And you can see here in an early season female whose eggs aren't really developed, these symbionts are really these strings that are just these balls of tissue. But if you look at a later season female, those bacterial strings are laying over the eggs, and they have to be because they have to be transmitted to the eggs. So at least one of the things we think they're doing in that late season development, it's important for these symbionts to be transmitted. And so the work I'm trying to do potentially could lead to trying to interrupt that transmission of symbionts, because that would be a really species specific way to target lanternfly. And so just to wrap up here, that's just some of the research going on with us at Penn State, but there's a lot of other stuff going on. Heather's doing a lot of work looking at lanternfly movement and feeding behavior in vineyards. She has a new paper that's come out, but she's taking this landscape approach to try to understand the movement of lanternfly from woodlots into vineyards. We're continuing to look at impacts on grape physiology. Folks are looking at flight behavior and dispersal. I'm looking at the endosymbionts. We're testing to see if lanternfly can transmit pathogens. We have no record of that, but that's really important to know. Kelly Hoover's looking at, to what extent does lanternfly require tree of heaven? And she just reported in a call we had with USDA this morning that lanternfly that she raised last year without access to tree of heaven, they mated, laid eggs, and those eggs just hatched. So at least they can make it through one generation without ailanthus. We're also looking at making sure that if we're testing red maples and other things, that the remaining pesticide residual that's there in the leaves and the flowers and pollen the next year is not a problem for pollinators and other non-targets. And then we're also looking at just efficacy of control, looking at tree physiology and toxicity of lanternfly to predators, among a few things. Just to mention, I have a publication, I'd be happy to share it with you, that kind of summarizes the lanternfly problem and its management and control in a nutshell. I'd be happy to send that to you if you'd like. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.